see. Now it should work. Does it work now? Oh, okay.
Okay, so just one of those technical things that we don't have to fool with in person. Good morning again, and thank you for coming to the Zoom meeting. By way of reminder, next month on November 20 will be our final meeting for the year. And of course, as last meeting, I explained that will be on Zoom also. Our target will be January 15 for the next meeting, which is also the third Saturday. And we will determine sometime during December and the holidays whether or not we feel safe for our membership to meet in person. The room reservations are all set. And so we're free to do that when we have that confidence to do that. I won't be here for the November 20 meeting.
What?
You're blessed, Jim. Count your blessing. And so I'll take this opportunity to wish you all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year for things to come. And that may be the first time you've heard that this year. But nonetheless, time marches on. What I want to do this morning for just a couple of minutes is to thank Pat for her work to support her Professor Jim and our Professor Jim for the work that he's doing here with her support. And she's done a couple of specific things to help us. Number one, she has transferred the Zoom recordings into the Facebook for us, which makes it far easier to log into that and to see it. So that's a plus for our members. And number two, she has purchased the audio and video device, which is now sitting on top of Jim's laptop, which gives us a better quality sound, a greater resolution video, and a wider field of view so that you can see President Reagan and other Republicans behind him on the wall.
But I'm talking about a Democrat.
Yeah, that's right. So she's done that. She received an incredible bargain at Best Buy, and so far it looks like it'll be a real plus for us, giving us all a better perspective in what we're looking at on the screen. So if you have comments about those kind of things, do let us know, and otherwise we'll just enjoy that. So Professor Spurlock, it's all yours.
Thank you.
And again, happy holidays.
Thank you, Paul. If not the oldest, the wisest of us all. Appreciate that, and good morning, everybody. I'm now going to see if I can pull up the share screen. It works. It works. Okay, so I have myself and I have Bailey on here, honey. Okay, we're at the PowerPoint presentation. And so we can start. we're going to talk today primarily about the what was happening after Yalta, after the Yalta conference, and before April the 12th, 1945, which, if you're of a certain generation, April the 12th, 45, it was one of those where were you when you heard days, um, like November 22nd, 1963. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the death of President Roosevelt, and we'll see how far we get. I ran into at a picnic, I ran into one of our members who said, I never get through everything that is on the title page. And that's true. But we don't have, as I think our older members know, older in years with us, we don't really have a clock. We don't have exams. We don't have term papers. So, we go at the pace that you feed me the pace you want me to use. A little bit more difficult on Zoom, but I hear from you by phone, email, or by bumping into you, and often people will say things like, would you say a little bit about, and so I'll add that to the next lecture. So again, we don't have a clock, although clearly we are getting to the end of the Second World War. Started with this photograph. We'll talk about it some more. This is an unfinished photograph. You can see the original at the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. And this portrait, which he was sitting for this portrait in President Roosevelt when he died, when he had a cerebral hemorrhage and died. So this is the last image of FDR. But I thought I'd begin on a lighter note. Everywhere you turn today, where James Bond is back in the news with the new Bond movie out, and which is apparently a blockbuster. People are actually going to movie theaters. And I thought we'd just take a couple of minutes and talk about the how James Bond became so popular in the first place. And it goes back, this is, by the way, the cover, not an especially great cover, but this is the cover of the original edition of Casino Royale, which was, I believe, the first Bond book written by Ian Fleming. And it was given to Senator John Kennedy by a friend. He's here with a man named Murphy, who was running for governor of Massachusetts. He was given a copy of the book in 1955. John Kennedy had been a senator for 2 years. He'd had a serious back injury, went back to the war into PT 109, and they thought he would be unable to walk for the rest of his life, and maybe worse. And so he had this major back surgery and was in the hospital for quite a while recovering. You see him here on crutches. While he was there, a friend gave him a copy of Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. And JFK read it, loved it, became a huge Ian Fleming, James Bond fan, and proceeded to read all the Bond books as they were issued. During the 1960 campaign for president, JFK even met with Ian Fleming. This is Ian Fleming on the right. Of course, Sean Connery, the original Bond, maybe the best Bond, on the left. And Ian Fleming, as a reminder, was a OSS agent. He actually was a spy during the Second World War for Britain and for the Allied cause. So he actually met with JFK and the Kennedy townhome in Georgetown. And apparently they had quite a discussion, not just about the books, but also they talked about intelligence, and they talked about the CIA, and they talked about, if he became president, things he should know or look out for, or concerning the intelligence community. They also talked, by the way, about Fidel Castro, who of course come to power in 1959. Another Bond fan was the head of the Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, brother of John Foster Dulles. Allen Dulles was Eisenhower's Central Intelligence Agency director, and briefly President Kennedy's CIA director, until after the Bay of Pigs, when he was fired. And so Dulles also was a big Bond fan of the books, and he instructed his Office of Technical Services at CIA to develop 007 style gadgets that might be used in real life by real life agents. They developed things like knife tip shoes. They also developed at CIA exploding cigars. Now, why exploding cigars? This is why. One of the thoughts was maybe they would give a poisoned or an exploding cigar to Fidel Castro. That harebrained plan never happened, but it is a fact that they developed them. Not long after his inauguration as president, JFK gave an interview where he was asked what were his favorite books. And he rattled off some intellectual highbrow choices: Stendhal's The Red and the Black, Churchill's magnificent biography of Marlborough were two he mentioned. I don't think the book was out yet, but he was a huge fan of Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, was about the events that led up to World War I. And he also mentioned From Russia with Love, which was one of the Bond books and one of his favorites. And coincidentally, who are the villains in From Russia with Love that James Bond is outwitting? They are Soviet agents. Get it? The Cold War. So I thought that was funny. Because the president of the United States mentioned that this was one of his favorite books, what happened then was the Bond phenomenon. The books start flying off of bookshelves. All the Bond books, especially this one, became instant bestsellers. Ones that had already out were reissued. Again, JFK had an important impact on American culture, and one was he turned Ian Fleming and the James Bond books into a phenomenon. The sales were so enormous after the Kennedy interview was published that historian Mark White Riley has said Ian Fleming should have paid Kennedy a percentage of the royalties. And in fact, he did pay him back in a sense. In his next Bond novel, The Spy Who Loved Me, it includes the line, what we need are some more Jack Kennedys. 007's sudden popularity also meant that Eon Productions rushed into production the first James Bond movie with Sean Connery, and it was screened at the White House. I think you all know the White House has its own little movie theater, and they screened Dr. No for JFK and Jackie, and I believe Ian Fleming was there and Sean Connery was there, and it was quite an event. And at the White House screening, of course, JFK reportedly loved the movie, He also turned movie producer when it was over, and told the director and producer of this Dr. No that that was great. And now the next one they should make From Russia with Love. A lot of people thought that was also humorous because if you remember, uh, John Kennedy's father had been involved with Hollywood and Hollywood stars, starlets, as they called them back then, and was also had been a film producer for a while. I guess it ran in the family, and JFK said, so the next one you ought to do is From Russia with Love. Um, it was, in fact, whether or not because of what the president said or not, Eon Productions' next Bond movie, again with Sean Connery, was From Russia with Love. And it was also pre-screened. A rough cut of it wasn't released in this country, the movie, until May of '64. This is also an original cover of the book. But it was a pre-screening, a rough cut of the movie was shown to President Kennedy in the White House. Of course, the poignant end of this story is that it was the last Bond film that JFK would see, because it was screened for him in the White House on November 20th, 1963. And the next day he departed for San Antonio and Dallas. So bittersweet ending, but I thought you might find amusing the story of John Kennedy, Ian Fleming, and how the Bond phenomenon started. Okay. Oh, by the way, this is the movie that when it was released in May of '64. And as you can see, very tasteful movie poster. Women are treated with great dignity in the poster. We'll leave it. Okay, let's go to another fine Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt. This is, he's on the Quincy. This is his return from Yalta, from the Yalta conference that we've talked about in quite a bit. This photograph is February 14th, 1945. Among others, is my pointer working? Good. Among others, the Secretary of State, Ed Stettinius. This is person was always at his side. Why am I drawing a blank? It'll come to me. Anyway, the presidential entourage and a guest on the Quincy as they're making their way back. There is a tragedy that occurs on the trip, and that involves the one of the military aide to President Roosevelt, who went back with him for many years. His name was Pa Watson. This is Pa Watson. People had strange nicknames back then, and Pa Watson is what everybody called him. He was actually a major general in the Army, and for many years had not only been FDR's military aide in the White House, but he also was a close personal friend, somebody he thought a great deal of Pa Watson. But Pa Watson suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died on the trip back from Yalta. This is a picture of opening day of the baseball season, 1941. FDR, of course, he couldn't really stand with Pa Watson, and you can see he's holding on to the Major General as he throws out the first pitch. This event was very upsetting to FDR. It left him, for most of the rest of the trip back, he was very quiet. He spent a lot of time in his stateroom. He said to Eleanor, I shall miss him almost more than I can express. So it's a withdrawn and somber president who returns to Washington. And I thought Sam Rosenman, this is one of these people nobody knows, but they should because he did have great influence on FDR. Longtime speechwriter Sam Rosenman, we've actually talked about Sam before, said or wrote later, many in Washington considered Watson merely a jovial companion to the president. He was much more. Like Missy LeHand, and we've talked about Missy LeHand, who had by now suffered a severe stroke. He had an uncanny instinct for distinguishing between the fake and the genuine in human beings and human conduct. The president had seen many of his friends die, but in his weakened and tired condition, the death of Watson seemed to have a more depressing effect on him than the death of any of the others. Again, interesting sidelight to the personal life of FDR. The other thing that's significant from Yalta and from here on in FDR's life is the role of his daughter. You may remember that Franklin and Eleanor had 5 boys and 1 girl, 5 sons, 1 daughter. This is Anna. You remember Eleanor's name was Eleanor Anna Roosevelt. This is Anna on the way to Yalta. Her name is Anna Roosevelt Bottinger. At the time, she would later divorce and remarry, but at this point, she's Anna Roosevelt Bottinger. She's 39 years old. She was, in many ways, played the role that Eleanor would have played at Yalta. And you'll remember in the complicated marriage of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Eleanor very much wanted to go to Yalta and to be of help to her husband. FDR had not taken her, but he had taken his daughter. And her daughter handled herself at Yalta extremely well. She was not only the president's daughter, but his political confidant, insider, sounding board. She became very important in FDR's presidency and his daily life from here on. Her husband, John Bottinger, husband at the time, pointed out to Anna the obvious. He said FDR had noticed that FDR turned to his daughter, not to her 5 brothers, for advice, and brought her into his inner circle. If you've seen the fabulous musical Hamilton, you might say Anna was now in the room. She was in the inner circle. Now, she never held any office never had an office in the West Wing. She lived in the White House during this period. She worked at a desk in her bedroom in the White House. Anna Roosevelt never had an official title. She never took a salary, unlike her brother, Jimmy Roosevelt, who did. But Life magazine, for example, had concluded by the spring of 1945 that without question, Anna was now the one to call to get FDR's ear. Eleanor, when you think about the progression, it's interesting. In the beginning, the confidant, the person to get to FDR, the person you went through was Eleanor, especially after he was hit with polio in 1923. Then it was Louis Howe, his campaign manager, who helped mastermind his rise to the governorship of New York and to the presidency. And then he died. Then it was Missy LeHand, who we talked about, who was not just his social secretary or administrative assistant, but in many ways, a White House chief of staff and a confidant of the president. And then it was, couldn't think of his name a moment ago, then it was Harry Hopkins. That was the person in the photograph. And Harry Hopkins had been, as we've talked about before, lived in the White House, very much alter ego to FDR. And Harry had become gravely ill. He was always ill, but he became gravely ill at Yalta, had to leave early, and in fact would never get better. Harry Hopkins would die in 1946. So now you have the last of the confidant inner circle sounding boards, and it's Anna, his daughter. Another observation I thought was interesting was Life magazine. And this is again, oh, by the way, this is Anna and her husband, then husband, John Bottinger, at about this period of time. I think this picture was taken in 44. And we shouldn't forget that the press didn't know what to make of this exactly, in terms of the fact that she's a woman. And typical is the comment from an article written by John Chamberlain, longtime journalist with Life magazine, who in the spring of 45 wrote in Life, "The rumor mongers have been whispering a new secret control of access. The secret control of access has passed to Anna Roosevelt, Bottinger, the long-legged, energetic, and handsome eldest child, the free-speaking, free-cursing daughter of President Roosevelt." Now, I don't remember when they were talking about Harry Hopkins articles about his legs, or articles about the fact that he cursed a lot. If he did, probably did, but it shows you again that the double standard you see in the press when the close advisor is a woman. So again, they try to trivialize her. This, by the way, is Anna and FDR are watching a baseball game, and they try to trivialize her, but in reality, she had real political power and real influence in the final months of the Roosevelt administration. And again, a nation still at war. Jim Farley, remember Jim Farley, who ran the first presidential campaign, was in charge of political patronage for the Roosevelt White House up until 1940. Jim Farley remarked, "Anna has the most political savvy and smarts of all the Roosevelt children." Chamberlain's Life magazine article, "For purposes of public consumption, she may continue to pose as someone simply living in the White House and prolonged transit from and to a newspaper job." She was a journalist. "But no matter what the White House press agents may say, it's a fair bet that Missy Lehand's shoes have at last found a permanent occupant. Daddy's girl has her work cut out for her running daddy." Again, I think it speaks for itself. I don't have to beat this to death, but it is interesting how she is portrayed compared to how someone like Harry Hopkins was portrayed. This, by the way, is an interesting picture. I'll come back to their story. This is Anna with her mother, obviously. You'll notice the ABC microphone. After the war, after FDR was gone, Anna and her mother actually co-hosted a radio show. It was political commentary on the culture. They interviewed guests of various kinds. Pretty highbrow for its time, pretty highbrow radio program. This aired in 1949 when this picture was taken. It ran for a couple of years, and it was called, cleverly, it was called the Eleanor and Anna Roosevelt Show. Very creative. But there's more about Anna and her mom, her mother, that we'll talk about. Oh, and this is one final photograph. Anna Roosevelt, um, my now she's Anna Roosevelt Halstead. She had remarried in 1952 and would remain married to Mr. Halstead for the rest of her life, which is well into the 1960s. This is Anna, this is the same person, but now this is 1968, and standing in the White House with a picture of her father behind is President Johnson and Anna Halstead, and they are discussing the issuance of a new publication by the United Nations celebrating the Declaration of Human Rights that had been adopted by the UN in the late 1940s, and whose principal author was Eleanor Roosevelt. So it all ties in. And it is interesting how long she remained a Washington figure of prominence. You may remember that after returning from Yalta, the president addressed the Congress and the nation. This is his joint session speech, March the 1st, 1945. And I referenced this before, so I won't go into great detail, except to remind you, this is the speech where he, for the first time, he used his wheelchair and coming down the aisle of the House of Representatives to the podium. It always before he'd seemingly walk with someone on his arm. Thunderous ovation. And this is a speech where he said, he began by saying, I hope you will pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation. But I know that you realize that it makes it a lot easier for me not to have to carry around 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs. And also because I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip to the Crimea and back for the Yalta conference. He got a huge ovation, and this is the first time and the last time that FDR ever referenced his polio, his disability in public. The only time it was ever mentioned. And in same speech, he would go on to say that he thought the trip had been successful. We'll talk about Yalta's consequences when we talk about the Cold War. And but he was in good form for the most part. He made some timely jokes. He was very serious in talking about he hoped that the Yalta conference, then called the Crimea conference, was a successful effort by the three leading nations to find a common ground for peace. At times, people did notice he kind of rambled a bit, but for the most part, he was in good form. And no one knew it at the time, but this address to Congress, again, it was on February March the 1st of 1945, was the last time the public would hear him speak. This would be the last Roosevelt speech, except for casual conversations with reporters. This is the last time the public would hear him give a speech. Now, where are we? We're in March, April 1945. If you're FDR surveying the world, how's the war going? What is the situation that he sees in March, April of 45? We know, and we'll talk about it probably even more in the future. We know that in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge, our topic last month, the Battle of the Bulge has been concluded. The last great offensive, the European conflict is over, and now the Allies, the British, the French, it's principally the British and the Americans, are closing in on Nazi Germany from the west, and Soviet Russia is closing in on Nazi Germany from the east. And again, Hitler will never again be able to launch a major offensive, and he's lost air superiority, massive losses of tanks, massive losses of soldiers, not that he cared. And you can, FDR would have seen in March, early April, that the war in Europe was just about over. In fact, it was Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower who repeatedly was warning his generals not to be the victims of what he called victoryitis, that the war wasn't over until it was over, and that there were still, unfortunately, Allied men and women and civilians who would die or be grievously wounded before the armistice. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say FDR knew that victory in Europe was close. In the Pacific, the struggle for Okinawa was underway. I've shown this map. April the 1st to June 23rd was essentially the Battle of Okinawa in the Pacific. It had turned very bloody, and by March, April, FDR would have seen that this last stop on the island hopping campaign to Japan was proceeding, but proceeding at great price. The Yamamoto, one of the heaviest battleships ever constructed, had been sunk by US bombers early on April the 7th, 1945. This is the Yamamoto going down. FDR would have known of that victory. He also would have known that the fighting was by our Marines in particular on the ground in Okinawa was fierce. At this point, they were at Mount Yaitake, YAE-TAKE. Mortars, machine guns, grenades seem to be coming from everywhere by this time, and American casualties were piling up by the hundreds. So FDR would have known that. He also would have known that that unlike much more than any other battle in the Pacific, the Allies, the Americans, and British and Australians in particular, mainly Americans, were suffering from kamikaze attacks on the US naval vessels offshore of Okinawa, what the Japanese called floating chrysanthemums, I guess it is. And you see here a Japanese aircraft about to crash, suicide mission, about to crash into an American American ship. This is a destroyer in this case. And over the next couple days, and this is in March 45, so there would be some 350 kamikaze aircraft that would slam into American ships. 350, unbelievable. On April the 6th of 45, 3 Allied ships were sunk outright. Another 15 were severely damaged. And again, these are things that FDR would have known about within hours of their occurrence. I'm pausing because I dropped my notes. By the way, on April the 10th, the 6th Division American division, suffered its worst losses in the north of Okinawa when it was attacked by more than 2,000 Japanese defenders at Mount Yaitaki, led to 400 days of tremendous hand-to-hand combat in many cases. 207 Marines gave their life. 757 were wounded in just that 4-day period. And this is another shot of a kamikaze attack on an American ship. FDR looked around in March, April of 45, and also seeing that while these scenes were common in the Pacific, here you're again at Mount Yaitaki with American Marines. He also knew that American air power was beginning to pay a tremendous levy a tremendous price on Japan for its continuance of the war. The architect of the bombing campaign of Japan, and by the way, after Okinawa fell and before Iwo Jima, now for the first time, our B-29 bombers, our B-29s could reach and bomb Japan. The architect who been brought over from Europe, from the 8th Air Force, was this man, Curtis LeMay, L-E-M-A-Y. He was appointed commander of the 21st Bomber Command in the Pacific by President Roosevelt on January 20th of 1945. And Curtis LeMay is one of those figures that is will always be controversial and in some ways is impossible to like. I'll just be blunt about that. Some of the controversy has to do with the saturation bombing of Japan, although people argue that it was or was not necessary because the Japanese were refusing to surrender. This is a time cover from the time of LeMay. Always seemed to have a cigar in his mouth as well. Curtis LeMay also, to give him credit, besides, you'd have to say, waging a successful, if brutal, campaign bombing of Japan in 45, after the war would go on to be the driving force behind the Strategic Air Command, SAC. And I think by most accounts, people give him credit for doing a fine job. He was a good administrator, as it turned out, in creating the Strategic Air Command. There are other parts of Curtis LeMay's later career that are not so uncontestably bad. Here he is with President Kennedy. At this point, he's one of the Joint Chief of the Air Force, obviously. And this picture is, again, the cigar, but this picture is very evocative of their relationship. President Kennedy could not stand Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay could not stand John Kennedy. And we'll talk about it in much detail when we get into the 60s. But at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and by the way, this is the day, but it is October the 16th. This is the day in 1962 that President Kennedy found out from U-2 reconnaissance photos that the Soviets had missiles and nuclear warheads in Cuba on this date. Some of the worst advice a military leader has ever given a commander-in-chief was given by Curtis LeMay, who wanted to immediately bomb Cuba. In fact, he wanted to bomb Cuba, he said, into oblivion. And we now know that if JFK had taken his advice, that nuclear warheads were already there and armed and would have been launched against American cities. So fortunately, LeMay's advice was ignored. And then the absolute bottom of his career comes in 1968 when he is the running mate for vice president on the American Independent Party ticket with George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, staunch segregationist, thoroughgoing racist and bigot, and Curtis LeMay was his running mate. So I think you'd have to say that was the nadir of the of his career without question. And while this is hard to take, we should remember that this ticket for George Wallace and Curtis LeMay got 19% of the vote, amazingly enough. The man who really was the architect of massive bombing was this man. His is Arthur Harris, British commander, and it was Arthur Harris who adopted a policy that would later be adopted in the Pacific by Curtis LeMay, and that was massive bombing campaign of Germany. And unlike the 8th Air Force that had tried to limit their bombing to to military installations, it had been Arthur Harris for the British who successfully argued that what was really needed was massive bombing of military installations and of German cities, which meant there would be large civilian casualties as well. He argued that the way to end the war was to make war unbearable for Nazi Germany. And so beginning in 1942 with the bombing of Lubeck, followed by Cologne, followed by Hamburg, followed by Dresden, Arthur Harris's strategy became Allied strategy of bombing military factories, military targets, regardless of civilian casualties. And this is Hamburg. Hamburg was one of the most well-known events. This is September 1943. This was taken from about 18,000 feet. Bombing of Hamburg would kill thousands of soldiers and thousands of civilians. Dresden, this is the bombing of Dresden. Again, a huge armada of American forces that would be actually the most destructive campaign of any single campaign in the European theater from the air. This is not to say that there was a lot of public resistance to the new style of saturation bombing in Europe, and then also beginning in 45 in the Pacific. This is typical, a Massachusetts newspaper from February the 12th, huge air armada pounds Germany. Again, there's not a lot of dissent. We'll do what we have to do is the attitude in this war. And they are describing, as you can see here, they're describing the bombing of Dresden. You can also see, by the way, that Russian army pushing on across Silesia, Japs, again, we don't say Japs anymore, slay civilians in South Manila, the Philippines, Canadian drive threatening to outflank the Ruhr, so forth and so on. So I don't want to mislead you to think that the massive bombing campaigns were intensely controversial in this country, because they were not. These are American B-29s. And I want to say something, and I hope that this is not taken the wrong way, but this is not to say that there's anything pleasant about the killing of civilians, and when major cities are attacked. But we also need to remember some perspective. Again, it's not that one justifies the other, but the perspective I would offer up is that let's not overlook the atrocities being committed by Nazi Germany and by Imperial Japan leading up to the decision to undertake saturation bombing. In the case of Japan, the Nanjing massacre, the bombings by the Japanese of Shanghai, Hankow, Chongqing, speak for themselves. Massive civilian casualties in each case. Let's not forget the so-called comfort women, the thousands of women and girls who were raped and enslaved and became essentially sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. And let's not forget also that it wasn't just Dr. Mengele who performed hideous, unspeakable experiments, so-called experiments on innocent human beings. Japanese did the same. You don't read much about it, but look up sometime Unit 731. Unit 731, something, by the way, whose existence the Japanese government denied until 1984, 40 years after the war was over, practically, had been in operation since 1938 in China, in which at least 3,000 Chinese civilians were abducted and had unspeakable quote experiments performed on them, including injecting them with plague, anthrax, cholera, other pathogens, ghastly experiments that I won't even describe to you. And Unit 731, although the Japanese for 40 years, the government would say they knew nothing about it, its central operations were in a facility in central Tokyo. In central Tokyo, where they were committing these unspeakable acts, crimes against humanity. And Unit 731 was supported by Japanese universities and medical schools. They had doctors on their staff as they, again, were inflicting civilians, primarily Chinese, with by the thousands with deadly experiments. We'll just put it that way. After the war, by the way, only a handful of people involved in Unit 731 were ever arrested, were ever tried as war criminals. And some of them, a prominent one is a Dr. Hoshado Yoshimura, Yoshimura, who conducted scores, probably hundreds of hideous experiments on human beings, was not tried, and in fact went on in post-war Japan to occupy important medical positions in both the public and private sector in Japan, in post-war Japan, and died of old age. So let's not forget that this is not one-dimensional. And I'll make one last point, and then I won't beat this in the ground further. The treatment of the Japanese by the Japanese of the Chinese, especially Chinese civilians, is something you just don't read about much. Again, we tend to focus on the European war over the Pacific to begin with, in our literature and our movies and in popular books. And secondly, when we do focus on the Pacific, we tend to focus, understandably, on Americans versus Japanese. The poor Chinese civilians were treated as barbarically as anyone. It's estimated, and these numbers are always going to be generalized because we just so many people just disappeared. But it's estimated that at least 10 million Chinese lost their lives, and maybe up to 30 million Chinese lost their lives. So between 10 and 30 million in the long war against Japan that began in 1931 and wouldn't end until 1945. And of these tens of millions, the majority of them were civilians, Chinese civilians. In fact, the number of dead Chinese villagers at the hands of the Japanese non-combatants easily surpasses by millions all the Japanese non-combatants or civilians who died as a result of American bombing missions. So enough of that, but I have to get that off my chest, I guess, as we talk about Dresden and we talk about the leveling of Tokyo, to remind ourselves that we need some context.
We're coming up on break.
Okay, we're coming up on break. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say on this general point. No, I don't think so. One thing that's interesting, by the way, is that there had been no bombing of Japan since 1942 until it resumed in late 44. And in 42, it was the Jimmy Doolittle raid, 30 seconds over Tokyo. And we've talked about how that was a one-time symbolic mission to show the Japanese people that they were not invulnerable from American air power. And then, of course, in late 44, and with LeMay's arrival, we will get to the furious firebombing, whose peak was March 9th and 10th, 1945, when LeMay sent 334 B-29s over Tokyo. 339 over Tokyo, flying at an average altitude of 7,000 feet. And it produced a firestorm. We had both bombs and napalm, and it produced a firestorm. This is to the warlords of Japan. This is on the eve of the Tokyo raid. Not forgotten, the B-29s will remind you again and again and again. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey would estimate that the winds and flames detonated by the bombs and the napalm leaped across about 15 square miles of Tokyo, generating immense firestorms that killed thousands. And that, to put it most bluntly, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey estimated, quote, probably more persons lost their lives by fire at Tokyo in a 6-hour period than at any time in the history of man. So it was not pleasant, but it is, these are the facts. And also, I hope I gave you some appropriate context. Okay, we're going to leave that. And again, remember the theme here. It was March, April 45. What is FDR seeing in Europe, in the Pacific? How is he operating in terms of his administration in Washington? Let's try to cover that briefly. And when we come back, we'll talk about the events of April the 12th, 1945 and their aftermath. Anything, Paul?
We're good.
Okay, we'll be back in, let's say, 10 minutes. We'll resume. Thank you.